Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
What happens when America's most beloved country music legend sits across from one of daytime TV's sharpest tongues and the conversation turns personal? You get a clash so raw the studio audience could barely breathe. Dolly Parton, the icon whose songs and smile have defined generations, walked onto The View expecting to talk about her latest tour. But the moment Joy Behar leaned forward, the energy in the room shifted. With that trademark smirk, Joy asked the question millions of fans never imagined hearing out loud. "Dolly, don't you think it might be time for seniors like you to step aside and let the younger generation take the stage?" The audience gasped. Whoopi Goldberg shot Joy a warning glance, but it was too late. The words had been spoken, and everyone knew Dolly wasn't about to let them slide. What followed wasn't just an interview, it was a generational showdown. Dolly's charm, grit, and unshakable dignity went head-to-head with Joy's unrelenting bluntness. Voices rose, the crowd erupted, and when Dolly finally snapped back with a fiery response no one saw coming, the studio froze in disbelief. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about respect, legacy, and the fight to prove that age doesn't define worth. The morning sunlight poured through the wide windows of the View studio, catching the shimmer of sequins as Dolly Parton made her entrance. The crowd leapt to its feet, clapping, cheering, some even whistling as she flashed that trademark smile. Dressed in a sparkling pastel suit with rhinestones catching the stage lights, Dolly waved with both hands, her southern charm radiating in every gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whoopi Goldberg said with a grin, "please welcome the one and only Dolly Parton." Dolly settled into her seat, her blonde hair towering high, her eyes twinkling. "Well, thank you kindly, Whoopi. Y'all sure know how to make a girl feel loved this early in the morning," she said, her voice lilting with that unmistakable Tennessee drawl. Sarah Haynes leaned forward eagerly. "Dolly, you're on tour again, releasing new music, and you never seem to slow down. What keeps you going?" The audience murmured their admiration, nodding along. Dolly chuckled. "Honey, if I sit down too long, I'll rust. I keep going 'cause I love it. Music's in my bones. If I'm still breathing, I'm still singing." Applause rippled through the studio. It was warm, safe ground, exactly the kind of lighthearted banter that made Dolly universally adored. But then, Joy Behar, who had been leaning back quietly with her arms crossed, cleared her throat and tilted her head with a sly smile. "Dolly, you've had one of the most legendary careers in entertainment. Nobody can take that away from you. But don't you ever feel maybe it's time to step aside, let the younger generation have the spotlight?" The studio seemed to freeze. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by awkward laughter, unsure if Joy was joking or dead serious. Dolly blinked, her smile faltering just for a moment before returning, softer this time. She clasped her hands together on the table. "Well, thank you, Joy. I never thought of myself as standing in anyone's way. The spotlight's big enough for all of us. Besides, music ain't a pie where one person's slice means less for another." The audience cheered, relieved at Dolly's gracious answer. Whoopi shot Joy a sideways look, silently warning her to tread carefully. But Joy wasn't done. She leaned in, her voice more pointed. "Sure, but let's be honest. There's only so much airtime, only so many festivals, only so many big tours. If legends like you keep holding on, where does that leave the newcomers? Isn't there a point where it becomes, maybe, selfish?" The air tightened again. The audience groaned in unison, some audibly muttering, "Ooh." Dolly's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes sharpened. "Well, I reckon if a young artist can't shine while I'm around, then maybe they need to sing a little louder," Dolly replied, her voice sweet, but her words edged with steel. The audience erupted, clapping and cheering loudly, some rising to their feet. Sonny Hostin jumped in quickly, trying to smooth the edges. I think what Joy is saying is, Dolly, you've built such a powerful legacy. Do you ever think about slowing down just to enjoy life more? Dolly laughed lightly, her charm disarming. Oh, I enjoy life plenty, sugar. I enjoy it when I'm working, I enjoy it when I'm writing, and I'll sure enjoy it when I'm singing till I can't no more. The audience cheered again, but the undercurrent was undeniable. The tension between Dolly's grace and Joy's bluntness was crackling like static in the air. Joy, not willing to retreat, smirked and muttered just loud enough for the mic to pick up, or until someone finally tells you to hang it up. The studio gasped so loudly it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Whoopi's eyes went wide, Sarah covered her mouth, and even Andy Cohen, sitting in as a guest that day, mouthed, "Oh my God!" Dolly sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her smile fading into something far more serious. For the first time all morning, she didn't laugh, didn't wink. She just stared at Joy with that piercing calm that only someone with decades of experience and an ocean of respect could command. The spark had been struck, and everyone in that studio knew the fire was about to spread.
The room buzzed with tension. The audience whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others whispering things like, "Did Joy really just say that?" The camera operator zoomed in on Dolly, whose smile had melted into a polite but unreadable mask. Whoopi Goldberg tried to cut the tension. Okay, let's not gang up on our guest here. Dolly's still out here breaking records. She just dropped an album, she's selling out shows. I think the audience is pretty clear about whether or not they still want her around. The crowd roared in agreement, clapping and cheering, but Joy wasn't backing down. She raised her eyebrows, smirking, as though the reaction only proved her point. Yes, but popularity doesn't answer the real question, Joy. Should someone in their 70s still be headlining tours, or should we at some point gracefully exit and let the younger voices lead the way? Dolly leaned forward, resting her glittering nails on the table. Her tone was still calm, but there was weight behind every word. Well, Joy, if you're lucky enough to live long enough to be my age, you'll find out that passion doesn't come with an expiration date. My voice still works, my fans still show up, and I don't see any harm in continuing to share what I love. The audience burst into applause, with some fans shouting, "We love you, Dolly," from the crowd. Joy gave a short, sharp laugh. But do you ever think that maybe the industry is holding on to you because it's nostalgic, not because you're what's relevant right now? The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Sarah Haynes placed her hand over her mouth, looking between Joy and Dolly as if silently begging them to stop before it went too far. Dolly tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. Relevance isn't about age, Joy. It's about connecting with people. You can't tell me a song that touches someone's heart is less meaningful just because it came from someone who's been around a while. The applause was deafening. Some audience members stood up, clapping fiercely. Whoopi leaned back with a satisfied smirk, as if to say, "That's the Dolly I know." But Joy pressed on, her tone sharper. "Sure, but look at it this way. Younger artists are struggling to get noticed in an oversaturated market. If the top spots are taken by people who've already had 50 years of fame, how do the newcomers ever get a fair chance? You can't deny you're part of a system that keeps the spotlight from shifting." The crowd booed faintly, a low rumble of disapproval directed at Joy. Dolly didn't flinch. She raised her chin and answered with steady confidence. "Joy, when I started, nobody handed me a spotlight. I was a poor girl from Tennessee who had to fight for every inch of ground I stood on. The younger ones coming up now, they've got more tools, more platforms, and more ways to share their voices than I ever dreamed of. If they've got the talent and the drive, they'll find their way. I'm not blocking anyone." That line hit like thunder. The audience erupted, applause, cheers, and whistles echoing through the studio. Joy's face tightened, her smirk faltering just slightly. So you don't think there's a point where it's selfish to keep going, to keep occupying the stage when others could use it? Dolly's response was swift. Honey, if sharing my songs is selfish, then maybe we need a little more selfishness in this world. Because from where I sit, music is about giving, not taking. I don't stand in anyone's way, I stand beside them. And if they can't shine with me on stage, then maybe they weren't ready to shine in the first place. The studio audience was on its feet now, clapping and shouting in support. Even Sunny Hostin joined in, shaking her head in awe. Whoopi raised her voice over the roar. All right, I think we can all agree Dolly still got it. But Joy leaned forward, refusing to let it drop. You can dress it up in all the rhinestones you want, Dolly, but at the end of the day, age catches up. Don't you worry about becoming a parody of yourself? About being remembered as someone who didn't know when to bow out? The room gasped so loudly the walls seemed to shake. Whoopi's eyes went wide. Sarah Haynes froze, and the audience began to boo Joy outright. Dolly didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply placed her hands on the table, leaned slightly closer, and said in her honeyed but firm tone, Joy, I'll tell you what. I'd rather be remembered as someone who never stopped doing what she loved than someone who quit because people told her she was too old. I'll take that legacy any day. The crowd exploded in cheers, so loud that the producers had to motion for quiet. And in that moment, it was clear the heat of the debate had shifted into something deeper, something personal, and Joy Behar had underestimated the steel beneath Dolly's sequins.
The studio air had grown heavy, thick with the weight of words that couldn't be unsaid. Joy sat stiff in her chair, arms crossed, lips curled in that trademark smirk that masked irritation. Dolly, by contrast, sat poised, her hands folded neatly in front of her, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her lips, but her eyes told another story. They glittered with something sharper than charm, something that said this wasn't going to be just another celebrity interview. The audience was restless, leaning forward in their seats, murmuring to each other. It was a kind of silence that comes not from calm, but from anticipation, like the hush before a storm. Sunny Hosting tried to intervene, her voice gentle. Dolly, a lot of people look up to you, not just for your music, but for your resilience. Do you think that's why this conversation feels so intense? Because your career represents more than just songs. It represents survival. Dolly's eyes softened as Sunny, but then shifted back to Joy. She took a deep breath, her southern drawl steady as she began. Let me tell y'all a story. When I was a little girl growing up in the Smoky Mountains, we didn't have much. My daddy worked hard, my mama worked harder, and music was the only thing that made me feel like I had something of my own. People told me even back then I'd never make it, that girls like me didn't belong on big stages, but I sang anyway. And I kept singing when folks told me I was too country. I kept singing when they said I was too flashy, too blind, too everything. And I kept singing when I got older, because the music's who I am. The studio went silent, except for a few soft murmurs of amen and yes from the crowd. Dolly's voice grew steadier, but there was a fire beneath it now. Joy, I've buried friends who never got the chance to keep chasing their dreams. I've seen people silenced by fear, by poverty, by society telling them to sit down and be quiet. I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't let anyone decide for me when my voice stopped mattering. The audience burst into applause, some standing and clapping, the emotion raw and palpable. Dolly's eyes glistened as she looked out at the crowd, and then back at Joy. You say maybe it's time for me to step aside, that I should bow out gracefully. Well, I've been bowing for 60 years. I bow every time I take a stage, but don't mistake grace for giving up, because as long as God lets me wake up in the morning, I'm going to keep singing, keep writing, keep sharing, whether I'm 30 or 90. The applause was thunderous now, echoing through the studio like a standing ovation at a concert. Joy, visibly rattled, raised her voice to be heard over the noise. But Dolly, don't you think part of this is about being realistic? You're not invincible. No one is. don't you worry about becoming a cautionary tale? About people saying she didn't know when to quit? The question landed like a stone in the room. The cheers quieted, leaving only the hum of tension. Dolly looked at Joy, her eyes narrowing. Joy, you're right. I'm not invincible. My back aches, my feet hurt, my hair's higher than it used to be to make up for what I've lost, she said with a laugh, earning chuckles from the audience. But you know what? That's life. You don't quit living just because you get older. You don't quit loving. You don't quit dreaming. And I sure as heck ain't quitting music just because some people think my time is up. The crowd roared again, rising to its feet, clapping and cheering so loudly that Whoopi had to wave her hands to calm them. Joy's smirk had faded completely now. She looked cornered, frustrated, and a little stunned. Dolly leaned in, her voice quieter now, but cutting sharper than ever. You see, Joy, the thing about aging is it's a gift. Every wrinkle, every gray hair, every year I've been given, it means I've lived. And if I'm still here, still strong enough to sing, then I'll do it. Not for fame, not for relevance, but because I still can. And because people still want to hear it. The audience exploded into cheers, some chanting, Dolly, Dolly, Dolly. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, shaking her head in awe. Well, I don't think anyone's going to top that. The energy in the studio was electric. Dolly had just turned the conversation into something bigger than herself. This wasn't about her career anymore. It was about the dignity of aging, the power of perseverance, and the right to define one's own legacy. And everyone could feel it. The emotional tide had shifted.
The chanting of Dolly, Dolly still echoed in the studio. The audience so energized, the floor itself seemed to vibrate beneath the applause. Whoopi glanced nervously at the producers, clearly signaling for calm, but there was no holding the room. Dolly Parton had just delivered a sermon in rhinestones, and the crowd was still riding the wave. But Joy Behar wasn't clapping. She sat rigid, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a hard line. When the noise finally simmered down, she leaned forward, her voice sharp as a knife. Okay, fine. You've got your fans riled up. You've told your little story about resilience. But let's be real here. This is television. This is entertainment. And there is a point when an entertainer becomes a caricature. You're 77, Dolly. Sequins, wigs, and corny one-liners, it's cute, but doesn't it border on self-parody? Don't you worry that you're just clinging? The words dropped like stones, and the reaction was immediate. The audience gasped, some booing, others shouting in protest. Whoopi muttered under her breath, "Oh, joy," while Sarah Haynes visibly winced. Dolly didn't answer right away. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on Joy with a calm intensity that was more intimidating than anger. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and cutting. "Joy," Dolly said softly, "if I'm a parody, then I've made a mighty good living out of it. But let me tell you something. I built this look. I built this brand. And I built it at a time when women weren't supposed to own a damn thing. So if you want to call it sequins and wigs, fine. But to me, it's armor. It's who I am, and I'm not ashamed of it." The audience erupted in cheers, stomping their feet, clapping so hard it drowned out the studio mics. Whoopi clapped too, grinning at Dolly's ferocity. Joy, rattled but unwilling to back down, sneered. "You know what? Maybe the problem is people like you set unrealistic standards. You keep working, keep smiling, keep glittering, and you make regular folks feel like they're failures if they can't keep up. Maybe that's the selfish part nobody wants to say out loud." The studio groaned, the audience now openly booing Joy. Whoopi raised her hands. All right, enough." But Dolly wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her palms smacking the table with such force that the coffee mugs rattled. The sound echoed like a gavel striking down judgment. "You'd listen to me, Joy," Dolly said, her voice ringing with conviction. "I never once told anyone they had to be like me. I never told anyone they had to sparkle or sing or smile through the pain. What I do is show people they can keep going, no matter what life throws at them. That's not selfish, that's hope. And if you can't see that,
then maybe the problem ain't me. Maybe it's you. The studio exploded. The audience roared, whistled, stomped, and clapped until the noise was almost unbearable. Sarah clapped too, looking both stunned and thrilled. Even Whoopi leaned back with a broad grin, clearly impressed at Dolly's unshakable fire. Joy, frozen, her mouth opening and closing without words. For once, Joy Behar, the woman who made her living sparring with the toughest voices on television, had nothing to say. And in that silence, the point had been made.
When the cameras cut to commercial, the studio still buzzed with the sound of the crowd's thunderous applause. Crew members exchanged wide-eyed looks, whispering to each other about what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't every day that a daytime talk show turned into a cultural flashpoint, and no one in the building doubted they had just seen something unforgettable. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair with an exasperated laugh. "Well," she muttered to no one in particular, "there's your headline for tomorrow." Sarah Haynes was still clapping softly, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe Dolly had just slammed her hands on the table and dressed Joy down in front of millions. When the show returned from the break, Andy Cohen, sitting in as a guest host that day, tried to inject some levity. "Okay, folks, I think we can all agree that was television history. Dolly, Joy, you sure know how to keep it lively in here." His grin was wide, but his eyes flicked nervously at Joy, who was still stiff and silent. Dolly, ever the professional, smiled at the audience, her voice warm again, though her words still carried weight. "I'll tell you what, I didn't come here to fight. I came here to sing and to share. But if standing up for myself and for others who feel pushed aside is what folks remember, well, then that's all right by me." The crowd erupted once more, chanting her name as the camera panned across their cheering faces. Joy gave a tight, forced smile, but the damage was done. The applause wasn't for her, and she knew it. The woman who usually controlled the conversation had been completely eclipsed by Dolly's grace and fire. By the time the episode ended, the internet was already ablaze. Clips of Dolly slamming the table went viral within minutes, racking up millions of views on Twitter and TikTok. Hashtags like Dolly Clapback, Dolly versus Joy, and Past My Prime trended worldwide. Fans rallied around her message. Dolly Parton just gave every older woman permission to never apologize for still being here, one viral tweet read. Another said, "Joy tried to take her down, but Dolly reminded us all that age is power, not weakness." Morning shows replayed the clip, with pundits dissecting every line. Columnists called it the ultimate generational showdown. Even critics who often dismiss celebrity talk show dust-ups admitted Dolly's words carried weight beyond the studio walls. For Dolly, it was another chapter in a legacy that had already spanned decades, proof that she could still command a room, still win hearts, still embody resilience in its purest form. For Joy, it was a rare misstep, one that left her rattled and on the defensive. On the next episode of The View, she brushed it off with a joke, but the shift in the audience's perception was undeniable. And for the millions who watched live or later online, it wasn't just a clash. It was a reminder that respect, earned over a lifetime, doesn't expire. That age is not a weakness, but a testament to survival. As the credits rolled that day, Dolly turned to the audience with that twinkle in her eye and said, "I reckon I'll keep singing till I can't no more." The studio gave her a standing ovation. And in that moment, Dolly Parton proved, once again, that she wasn't just an entertainer. She was a force of nature.